This episode of the Audacity to Podcast is brought to you in part by GoToMeeting with HD Faces. Welcome to the Audacity to Podcast, episode 93, 5 steps to an unstoppable vision for your blog or podcast. Hello, thank you for joining me for this episode of the Audacity to Podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, and this is a how-to podcast about podcasting and using Audacity. It's where I give you the guts and teach you the tools to podcast with passion, organization, and dialogue. And today, we're going to focus some on that passion as well as the guts of podcasting, because I got inspired. I was planning to do something else today, but I was actually inspired for this podcast by something I heard in a church service yesterday. My pastor was preaching on getting back to our roots and refocusing. And if you're not a churchgoer, don't worry. I'm not going to cram anything down your throats right now. I have a separate podcast for doing that, areyoujustwatching.com. But I do want to share something that was inspirational. And even if you're not a churchgoer, you're probably going to relate to some of the things I say about certain kinds of churches out there and then see how this relates to podcasting. Because I want to talk to you about ways that you need to have, or ways that you can build a vision for your podcast or your blog. And a lot of this applies whether you're blogging or podcasting, but something that will be unstoppable. You work on these 5 things, take these 5 steps, and I would guarantee you will have an unstoppable vision for your podcast. But before I get into that, I want to thank my sponsor for this episode, GoToMeeting by Citrix. This is the summertime and everybody's on a different schedule. People are traveling, people are working from home, people are taking time off, they're working odd hours, doing all of these things. And trying to get all of these people together for an in-person meeting is impossible. But that's why I recommend GoToMeeting with HD Faces. That way you can meet face-to-face online with clients, colleagues, and coworkers, no matter where they are in the world. Pick a time that works easily for you, which will be so much easier because people won't have to try and come in and to have the face-to-face meeting. They can just hop on their computer or even join a meeting from their iPad, iPhone, Android phones, or a computer or a phone call. It's really cool. But to get the best experience, you really got to have something with that nice camera on it so you get the nice HD faces. GoToMeeting by Citrix uses the webcam and just a few clicks and you can have an online meeting, unlimited meetings in a month. So you can collaborate on documents, you can share your screen, you can even share control of your computer, or your clients and colleagues and coworkers can share control of their computer with you, and you can have these great meetings face-to-face online. An unlimited number of meetings every month that you have GoToMeeting. It's super easy to use and really fast to set up. My listeners can try GoToMeeting free for 30 days. Don't wait for this special offer. Visit gotomeeting.com, click on the Try It Free button, and use the promo code PODCAST. Be sure to use the promo code PODCAST. And thank you, Citrix, for your support. I really appreciate it. So let's get into this. 5 steps to an unstoppable vision for your blog or podcast. And I'm saying unstoppable in the sense of, as long as you come back to this, you will be able to continue podcasting even during those days that it's a struggle for you. You'll be able to continue podcasting beyond those numbers that it's hard to get over that hump, like the 7th episode, 15th episode, 23rd, 50th, 100th episode. You'll be able to get past those things. By the way, speaking of 100th episode, the 100th episode of the Audacity podcast is coming up very soon, just a few more weeks away. And I would love to have your top tips for podcasting, because I want to try and include 100 podcasting tips from 100 different people. So pick a few tips, send them to me Audio would be great, especially if you got nice podcasting gear. But I know I've got many more than 100 listeners. So send me your best tips and try and divide those tips up so I could just use one or the other. Don't say, here are my top 3 tips, and then give me 3 tips, but say, here's my top tip. Or you could just say, just give me your tip. Don't tell me, here's my tip. Just give me your tip. And if you have multiple tips, make it sound like I could just cut it so I could use just one of them. That way, if I get duplicates, I can make sure I try and incorporate as many people as possible. Please send that to me. Feedback at theaudacitytopodcast.com. That can be an audio file. Written is okay too, but I'd love to have your voice in that episode, or written. And you can also call in to 903-231-2221 or go to theaudacitytopodcast.com and click on the send a voice message tab and record that message right from your computer. So that'll be the 100th episode. And that will be awesome. I'm really looking forward to it. 100 of the best tips about podcasting in the 100th episode. I'm excited about that. But anyway, getting back to this episode's main content, 5 steps to an unstoppable vision for your blog or podcast. Now, I will frequently use the phrase either blog or podcast, or I might just say your content. Whatever you produce, it's essentially the same thing. And I kind of hate that I always have to use both words, blog or podcast, but so much of this does apply to one or the other. And you're really going to see that here, because podcasting is really just an audio or video extension of blogging. What is blogging? Blogging is writing quality content and distributing it on a website. Podcasting is producing quality content and distributing it on a website and through multiple channels. I think podcasting is so much more personal because it can be your voice and face more than blogging, but so many of the principles still apply. So here they are, 5 steps to an unstoppable vision for your blog or podcast. Number 1, have a reason or goal, or have many reasons or goals. Why are you blogging, or why are you podcasting? Most of our reasons for this, most answers that we might give, would fall into maybe about 4 different categorizations. Maybe you're blogging for pleasure or as a hobby, or it's just to entertain others. That's really what my Clean Comedy podcast is about over at cleancomedypodcast.com. It's really just, I wanted to entertain people. It was fun. It started out as a hobby, just something I wanted to do because I enjoy it. Maybe you've got a hobby you really enjoy, and that's why you're podcasting. Or maybe that's what you should be podcasting about, what you're really passionate about and what you enjoy. And here with the Audacity to Podcast, that's why I started this, because I had a hobby. I had something that I like to do. So I wanted to do that and share it with other people. Not so much to entertain. That's not quite my goal. I know one person left a review in iTunes, which, by the way, thank you so much for the reviews in iTunes, theaudacitytopodcast.com/iTunes, if you'd like to leave a written review. But someone on there had said something like, for having a clean comedy podcast, he sure isn't funny in the Audacity to Podcast. And that's funny. But that is completely fine with me, because my goal here with the Audacity to Podcast isn't to entertain, but I am sharing something that's a passion and a hobby. Well, actually, it's more than a hobby now, but I am sharing it with you. So that's possible reason number 1. Number 2, typical categorization is to make money in some way or another. Maybe it's to make money directly from the podcast. They want this podcast to build a business for themselves, or they want advertising in the podcast, or they want to try and sell something through the podcast, whatever, to make money. That's a common reason. Number 3, to educate or encourage people. This is like the content that I have in my other podcast, areyoujustwatching.com, which is Christian movie reviews with critical thinking. Now, that does cram Christianity and worldview down your throat. So if you don't want that, or if you want to fight against it, that'd be a great podcast for you to listen to. But that one there, I really want to educate and encourage people in their faith and critical thinking about what they're watching, and critical thinking in their faith. And here with the Audacity to Podcast, I really want to educate people on podcasting, on using these tools, on specifics like how to use it, what's the best tool, what steps they need to follow. And I want to encourage you in your podcasting. That's why I say giving you the guts and teaching you the tools to podcast with passion, organization, and dialogue. Because I want you to have those guts. I want to challenge you, motivate you, encourage you, all of those words that basically mean the same thing. Number 4, basic categorization that many reasons and goals fall under: to build some kind of branding or promote something you do. This would be like if you have a podcast, if you are, here's an example of one of my clients is a dentist and they have a dentistry podcast. Actually, they're doing 2 dentistry podcasts. We're not quite finished working on their podcast. So, but you can check out his website over at midtowndentistry.com. I didn't do the website design, but I did do the podcast cover that will be coming out for both of his podcasts. That's at midtowndentistry.com. And he's going to have 2 podcasts about dentistry. One of them will be more for a layman. One will be for other dentist professionals. So by sharing that, he's building his own branding, establishing himself as a subject expert, and will receive respect and admiration from others. And it's also promoting his side business. And I haven't heard his new episodes yet that he's going to be doing, but I'm not sure if he's going to be selling anything, but certainly his podcast builds his brand. And that might be his only reason, is he wants to do a podcast that helps build his brand. Maybe that's the same thing for you. So you want to establish yourself as an expert in a certain field. So you start a podcast about it. You give the information away for free, or you start a blog about it. Again, giving the information away for free shows people how much you know about it. Then when people want to know more or want to hire someone who knows more, they'll come back to you. This happens a lot for me with the podcasting and consulting, because I offer one-on-one consulting and I do web design. And so when people visit my sites, they see they look nicely designed and they get to hear me. You get to hear the information I offer and share. And I try and give out as much as I can and as much as I can pack into the episodes. And still people come and want to pay me to do these things for them because they trust me. We've built a relationship over feedback or email exchanges. I've helped them in some way or another. This is building my brand. I'm not making money directly from the Audacity to podcast all of the time. Sometimes I am, like with affiliate links or advertisers. But a lot of times it's building branding for me. And that's the same thing with my Once Upon a Time podcast over at oncepodcast.com. It's very much a pleasure and to entertain others, and also to build more branding and recognition for the other podcasts that I make in Noodle Mix Network over at noodle.mx. Have I mentioned all of my podcasts at this point? I think I have. Well, even like my affiliate podcast that's in Noodle Mix Network but hosted by someone else, Christian Meets World, is to educate and encourage people. Not so much to build branding or make money, or for him, it's a pleasure and a hobby that he's enjoying sharing. But also, Jason Rennie has the purpose of educating and encouraging people. So those are the basic categorizations that I could come up with for reasons and goals that you may have for podcasting. But think about yourself specifically. Why are you podcasting or blogging? Or why do you want to podcast or blog? It needs to be a specific reason for you. If you don't have a reason, then you'll really struggle sometimes when you don't feel like podcasting or blogging, because you won't have that reason inside you to push you to still continue to do it. Sometimes you just do it because you know you need to, or because you know people are relying on you. It really depends on your reason. So I really think that your content does need to have some kind of goal with it. Do you want to get a new job? Do you want to change your lifestyle? Do you want to be seen as an expert in your field? Or maybe you want to connect with others that are in this field that you're really interested in. So you want to connect with them by posting similar content and collaborating with them on projects. Or maybe you want to connect with other people who have the same passions and hobbies as you do, and you want to either find this community or start this community out there. This and many more could be reasons and goals for your blog or podcast. But without a reason or goal, you're just going to drift in and out of relevance and even quality. So consider, why are you podcasting? Have a reason, have a goal, or have many of them. That's number one. Number two, don't focus on audience numbers. This is where I really got the inspiration from the church service I attended yesterday. The pastor was talking about, he was going to these church retreats or church meetings that were in this particular association of churches. And he would go there and he would sit among these other pastors, and they were talking about things like, oh, well, how many members do you have in your church? Or how big is your church subscription roll? Or how big this, how big that? How many ministries are, all of this? How many full-time staff are you paying? And all of these things about numbers. And regardless of whether you go to church, imagine you go somewhere where maybe the numbers aren't very big. Maybe you're in a group of 100 people, but the person leading this group is more interested in getting new people into the group. What does that mean? What's that saying basically to you? Well, it's saying, in a way, it's communicating that he's more interested in bringing new people than reaching out to the people he already has. And think about that with churches. Have you ever attended a church that was like that, or any kind of group that was like that, where they really seemed like they were far more interested in getting new people in, hooking them in some way, than keeping the people that they already have and reaching those people that they already have the best way possible? Creating great content is never, ever about the number of followers. How many people who write amazing books start out writing the book thinking, I'm going to write this book so that it will be read by 2 million people? Now, sure, people have dreams. They might have dreams of being on the New York Times bestseller list or having 1 million copies sold or anything like that. Sure, those are dreams. But is that actually driving their writing style and the quality of their content? Yes, it's helpful to track your numbers and see how you're doing. Like, are you growing? Are you shrinking? What information or what content you share is the most popular? What does it seem that people like the most that comes from you? But if you focus on those numbers, then you really become just a people pleaser. Have you ever seen television evangelists? What do they basically preach? It's so often, it seems like this thing that we call prosperity gospel, where you follow God, he'll give you a new car, he'll fix your marriage, he'll fix your kids, he'll fix your dog, he'll fix your house, he'll fix your plumbing, he'll make all of this, you'll fix your job, you'll get promoted, all of this stuff if you just give your life over to Jesus. Have you ever heard that before? Oh, it makes me sick. And I'm a Christian, and that kind of stuff, that's not what the Bible is talking about. But that kind of thing is the same kind of thing, that it's just information that people want to hear. Lots of people like hearing that kind of thing. It sounds easy. It sounds friendly. It appeals to lots of people, but it's not actually addressing the needs of people, especially not addressing the needs of the people who are already in the audience. And so often, many of these churches seem to be so focused on the offering, like pushing people to give, because we need to pay down our church debt that we got, all of this big debt that we borrowed because we wanted to have this mega church that's way over lavish than it needs to be, and all of this stuff. And we're not supporting missionaries, and we'll just ignore that right now. But do you know what I'm talking about? They're focused more on the numbers, on the size of the audience, than the quality of the relationships, the quality of the presentations or the sermons that they're giving. Don't let your podcast go that same way. In the church service I attended yesterday, the pastor was talking about this, and he said, now, the church I go to is somewhat of a larger church, not a mega church, but there are, on the Sunday service I go to, there are a few hundred people there. And the church has been blessed, but they don't always preach the feel-good kind of stuff. A lot of people sometimes leave the church crying, convicted of things, or just realizing how messed up certain things are. And there are such great relationships going on because they have a different focus there. It's very unique. So when you are building content, creating content, and building an audience, don't focus on just building the audience. Focus on your content, because when your content is good, an audience will follow. If you're focusing on your numbers, then you might as well get on a site like dig.com or reddit.com and look at the titles of things there and just imitate what those titles are. Post pictures of cats or puppies or anything like that, and you'll get lots of people coming to your site. They won't engage with your site at all. They won't participate. They won't become relationships with you. They'll just come, laugh, and leave. CLL, come, laugh, leave. Don't be like that. Don't focus on the audience numbers. That's number 2. So number 1, have a reason or goal, or many. Number 2, don't focus on the audience numbers. Number 3, know the kind of blog or podcast you want yours to be. This is where I really got the inspiration yesterday in the sermon, is the pastor was talking about how often he gets asked by people, how big is your church? How many people are in your church? How many people do you want to be in your church in 5 years from now? Or how big, what kind of growth do you expect? Or what kind of growth are you planning for? All of this stuff. And he presented this in a very humorous way, but he basically said he doesn't know. And in a sense, he really doesn't care how many people are coming or how big the number grows. What he cares about is where he wants to see the church, what kind of church he wants it to be in a few years, regardless of how many people are there. And that's what really stood out to me and inspired this thought, is what kind of blog or podcast do you want yours to be? Do you want your podcast to be a market leader in its industry? Do you want it to be a funny podcast? Do you want it to be the funniest in its industry? Do you want it to be unique in a certain way? Do you want it to fit in with others? Do you want it to eventually branch out in some way? Do you want it to launch you into a career? What kind of blog or podcast do you want it to be in a year, 2 years, maybe even 5 years? Think about some of these podcasts out there are releasing content that is so tied to the time that it's released. So 2 weeks later, that content isn't as valuable because it's very, very time-based. And podcasting is time-shifted. I'm sure you are probably one of the many people who have found this podcast, subscribed, and then gone back to past episodes and listened to old stuff. That's because I really worked hard to try and create a lot of episodes that have timeless content. So do you want your podcast or your content, your blog, to be relevant in 5 years? Or is it okay with you if the content you produce today is forgotten in 5 years? That's okay too. It's totally okay. It's really what kind of content do you want to be producing, and what do you want it to be like in the future? Do you want to have always fresh, always new content? Do you want your new method or presentation of your content to be even better in the future than it is now? Do you want your podcast to achieve something better? Like maybe do you want your podcast or blog to change people's lives? Or do you want it to help people to achieve a better lifestyle or achieve their dreams? What kind of blog or podcast do you want yours to be? Know that, and that will help you have an unstoppable vision for your blog or podcast, because the kind of podcast it is has almost nothing to do with the numbers. I look at my podcast, The Ramen Noodle, Clean Comedy Podcast, over at cleancomedypodcast.com. I look at what it was when I first started. It was a solo podcast, just me. I would write a script. I would perform the script, kind of slightly dramatized, dramatic reading, more like, and then take hours to edit it and then post it. That was what it was back then. But then I started listening to other clean comedy podcasts, and there were several back then that aren't around anymore. And I got inspired of, there are better ways to do this. I want to be a better podcast. I want this clean comedy podcast to be better in a couple of years. I want it to have lots of feedback from listeners. I want it to be a constant thing that even in our own lives encourages us to laugh about the bad things that happen rather than cry about the bad things. Of course, when appropriate, that is. And so now, years later, how much has the audience grown? Well, how much has it grown? That's kind of an odd question for that podcast because it had a huge spike in growth and then a drop off because of a certain thing that I did. But essentially, I did have a goal at some point last year that I said I wanted to double the audience. I figured that in my mind. I wanted to double the audience, and I did. But the audience, again, that was a numbers focus. But then when I think about what kind of blog or podcast do I want it to be? That's what I can focus on and work toward that. Instead of trying to increase the numbers, I want to reach the numbers I have so much better. Again, like I said, pursue much greater content, and building your audience will be so easy. It might even be automatic if you're building great content for your blog or podcast. So 1, have a reason or goal or many. 2, don't focus on audience numbers. 3, know the kind of blog or podcast you want yours to be. And 4, do something daily toward where you want to be. So now that you know some kind of reason you're blogging, you have some kind of goal, and you know what kind of blog or podcast you want to be in maybe a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever. What will it take for you to get to that point? What will it take for you daily to get to that point? Trying to find those things that you can do every day, if possible. If not, sometimes it might be weekly, each time you release an episode, maybe, or each time you post a blog post, if you blog weekly. But find something that you can do daily to get you toward that point. Take those tiny little steps. And then 2 years or 5 years from now, you can look back and realize, wow, I came a long way. I never knew I would be here 5 years ago. I wanted to be here, but I didn't think I could be here. Well, it's all of those baby steps that you took along the way. For example, if you want to produce more episodes, publish regularly and consistently. Or if you want more community feedback, focus on relationships, ask great questions, respond to the feedback you already have. If you want nicer equipment, maybe it's for your blog, podcast, video podcast, anything like that, or you want to enhance your quality in some way or do something that you couldn't do before, like maybe you're blogging and you want to jump into podcasting. Maybe you're doing an audio podcast and you want to jump into video podcast. Maybe you're doing a video podcast and you want to live stream it, or you want to do high definition or anything like that. Maybe then it means skipping coffee or soda 1 day a week for a couple years to save that money. Or what if you want to get better at really any aspect of the content that you're producing or what you do? Then invest the time daily to learn and grow in your knowledge, relationships, and techniques. These and so many other things are ideas of ways that you can do something daily toward where you want to be. Sometimes it might be doing the same thing over and over and over. Like if you're going to build a tower, how do you build it? You place a brick, you place another brick, you place another brick, you place another brick, doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over. It might feel like you're not getting anywhere because all you're doing is you're placing bricks. But then you have to realize, no, you're not just placing bricks. You're building a tower. Maybe you're not just building a tower. You're building a home. You're building some place that will change the world. See, look beyond the single tiny little thing you're doing right now. Look at the big picture. Break it down into little pieces. Something that you can do right now and that you can do daily, if at all possible, daily, toward where you want to be. I got a great tip from Steve Robbins over at getitdoneguy.com, one of his past episodes, and I can't remember which one it is. he mentioned how to get some stuff done, like that you keep procrastinating, how to fight that. And he said, a great tip. I love this. He said, set a timer on yourself. Maybe it's 15 minutes. We'll say it's 15 minutes, and we'll use cleaning the garage, for example. My wife and I just cleaned our garage, finally. After, I don't know how many years I've been in this house, the garage is finally clean. Wow. It took several years and getting married for that to happen. But we finally cleaned the garage. But maybe you're not able to just spend hours and hours cleaning the garage. Well, take 15 minutes, set a timer, and start working on it for 15 minutes. When the timer goes off, stop working on it. Resist that urge of, oh man, I'm in the zone. Because as Steve pointed out, the next time you try and do the task, you're going to have this little thing in your brain that said, yes, I gave myself 15 minutes last time, but I ended up taking 2 hours and I didn't get anything else done. So keep yourself to that time that you set. And I've done this several times, like just cleaning up my studio. Sometimes I get all of these papers or emails or all of this stuff that I need to deal with. And if I just set a time limit and give it 15 minutes and then stop, and then the next day, 15 minutes and stop, it really helps. It's doing something daily toward where I want to be. So number 1, have a reason or goal or many. Number 2, don't focus on audience numbers. Number 3, know the kind of blog or podcast you want yours to be. Number 4, do something daily toward where you want to be. And number 5, revisit and refocus on your goals often. Write down your goals. Write down what you want your podcast to be. And put it somewhere visible. Someplace that you can easily refer back to. Even if it's right in front of your face, take some time every now and then to intentionally reread it and think, am I fulfilling this? Am I doing something toward this goal? Or you may even find that you want to change your goal slightly because you've matured in some way, and so you want to change it a little bit. When I first started the Audacity to podcast, it was originally going to be a podcast about podcasting and Audacity. That's what I figured. I figured I would be the only podcasting podcast to frequently talk about Audacity. That was my premise. Since then, it's changed. I came up with this tagline when I created the audacitytopodcast.com as its own separate site. I came up with a tagline that's also full of search engine juice, but I came up with this: a how-to podcast about podcasting and using Audacity. Not only is that great for search engines, but it also describes what kind of podcast I want this to be. A how-to podcast about podcasting and using Audacity. So I frequently revisit that because I might be struggling with content, and this does happen very often. I'll struggle with something, but I've defined a niche here with this tagline, a how-to podcast. And so when I look at the content, I may be struggling with figuring out how to communicate this, or what way to present this, or what I even want to present. I then think about it as, how can I make this practical? How can I make this thorough? How can I make it very how-to and informative and timeless as well? How can this be useful 2 years from now, 5 years from now, maybe, unless the technology completely changes? So look back at the Audacity to Podcast episodes and see how many episodes are titled How To, or so many ways to do this, or so many steps to do this, or titles like that. That's because I frequently come back to this and refocus on, what are my goals with this content? What kind of content do I want to be presenting? And there might be times when you look at this and you'll realize that your goals have changed. Your content has changed a bit. And so you want to redefine your goals, give you something new to work. Maybe you discover that something works so much better, just like I discovered that giving this how-to kind of information, practical informative, easy to follow, thorough, compelling, and even sometimes timeless information is my niche on this. And I didn't realize that until I was already into producing the content. So my goals changed when I revisited them and refocus on them frequently. So 5 steps to an unstoppable vision for your blog or podcast. Number 1, have a reason or goal, or many. Number 2, don't focus on audience numbers. Number 3, know the kind of blog or podcast you want yours to be. Number 4, do something daily toward where you want to be. And number 5, revisit and refocus your goals often. I also highly recommend that you check out my friend Cliff Ravenscraft's site, podcastanswerman.com. He's done a couple episodes, and I'll have a link in the show notes over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/93, where he's mentioned this gentleman, Earl Nightingale, who did this training video or audio called The Strangest Secret. And it's really good. I've listened to the whole thing. And this is kind of funny, when I looked back at what episode it was that Cliff originally covered this, because he talked about it a lot more than he did in one of his most recent podcast Answer Man episodes, I realized that one of the episodes he did that talked about The Strangest Secret was an episode of Business Tech Weekly podcast where I called in and said, I just quit my job. Now what? And I received some great guidance. And it was really cool to look back at those tips and realize these are the things I'm still doing. And I come back to these things as goals or refocusing or revisiting these things. So it's helped me just looking back at that. So I've got a link to, it's actually a search result on Cliff's site that I recommend that you go over there, or just go to jspn.tv and search for Strangest Secret. But I'll have the link in the show notes at theaudacitytopodcast.com/93. And you can hear some of that. And one of the things, the major things that Earl Nightingale talked about in that audio that's on there, I'm not sure if you can still get it for free anywhere. It used to be on Google Video. But he talked about how men these days don't think. They don't dream. They don't see the future. They go about doing things without thinking, like machines or robots, not looking to the future. Don't let your podcast be like that. That will be a stoppable podcast. I want you to have an unstoppable vision. And you know what? Sometimes that vision does mean stopping your blog or podcast. And that's perfectly all right. If you do it, please do it intentionally and announce it. Don't just fade out and disappear, but intentionally do it and announce that you are closing it and ending it or rebranding it or whatever. I'm not a fan of rebranding, but that's something completely different to talk about. So check out this information and a whole lot more over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/93. And I also want to tell you a couple other things that you should check out. Podcastersroundtable.com is where several podcasters get together to talk about podcasting. Actually, it's even more meta than that. It's several podcasters who podcast about podcasting get together to podcast about podcasting, which we have a lot of fun with it. It's over at podcastersroundtable.com. It's led by Ray Ortega of the podcasterstudio.com. And it also has Dave Jackson of schoolofpodcasting.com and myself, and we get frequent guests. And the latest episode, I was not able to make it to that one. I had to back out at the last minute. But they talked about audio processing, a great episode with some different opinions on how much processing should you do. Should you even do processing? What's too much? What's too little? Not very much how to, but very opinionated stuff. And it's a lot of fun. I really suggest that you go over there and send recommendations of content for us to cover, especially the controversial kind of content. Something that we can fight over. Pretty soon we're going to be talking about monetizing your podcast, like what do we like, what don't we like, and so many different opinions and stuff. So check that out over at podcastersroundtable.com. Again, remember, the 100th episode is coming up very soon. It's 7 episodes away since this is episode 93. I want your top tips on podcasting to be a part of it. This is not going to be Daniel J. Lewis's 100 podcasting tips. This is going to be your podcasting tips, the top podcasting tips from fantastic podcasters. It doesn't matter if you're a top podcaster. If you're a podcaster and you have a tip that you'd like to share, please send that to me. Audio or written would be fantastic. Email that or any other questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, send that to the feedback information, which is email address feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com or call 903-231-2221. And you can also go to theaudacitytopodcast.com and click on the send a voice message tab and record a message right from your computer. Please only use that though if you have the nice equipment going into your computer. Otherwise, it often tends to result in a very noisy recording. But whatever works best for you is what I'd really like. And I'd love for you to be a part of this. 100 tips. I'm really excited about what kind of tips I'm going to get from all of you guys. And I'll put in, some of my own tips. I'll get some tips from other podcasters who podcast about podcasting, like Dave Jackson, Dan Lyons, Ray Ortega, Cliff Ravenscraft, and others who have blogs and stuff relevant to podcasters like Mike Phillips or Max Flight, and so many other people out there that are listening to this. And you, I want your tips. Please send that. I'm really, can you tell? I'm really looking forward to this episode. It's going to be a lot of fun. It hopefully won't be a 100-minute long episode, so I'm going to have to go through those tips real fast. And if you want to comment on the show notes and the topics for this episode that I covered, and share your opinion, share how you have kept yourself going, share what you do when you don't feel like podcasting, or what are your goals in podcasting? Why are you podcasting? How have your goals changed over the years, or how have they kept you from changing over the years? Whichever way works best. Please comment on the show notes for this episode at theaudacitytopodcast.com/93. And I'd love for you to join me when I do this show live every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's GMT -4 over at noodle.mx/live. I'm really grateful for the people that showed up today to listen and watch live as I record this episode, and I'd love for you to be a part of it, and especially would love for you to be a part of the 100th episode. So send in that content now, and I'll get it included in the 100th episode of The Audacity to Podcast. Also go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/iTunes, and I'd love it if you would leave a 5-star rating, if that's an honest rating, but a rating or review over there in iTunes. That's theaudacitytopodcast.com/iTunes. And you can follow me on twitter.com/theramennoodle. Also check out all the other past episodes I've made and sign up for the free email newsletter with podcasting tips and Audacity tips. I'm right about to send out something else really cool over there. You can sign up for that at theaudacitytopodcast.com. If you need any website design or podcast cover art design or anything like that, please let me know. Email me and contact me through all the normal means. Again, that's feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com or 903-231-2221, or just click the send a voice message tab from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Check out podcastcoverart.com and see some of the latest designs I've created for some really cool clients who are doing some awesome things in podcasting. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go podcast with passion, organization, and dialogue. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. Thank you for listening. The Audacity to Podcast is a proud member of the Noodle Mix Network. Find more of our podcasts like Once Upon a Time, Clean Comedy, Christian Movie Reviews with Critical Thinking, and Christian Worldview over at noodle.mx. The Audacity to Podcast is also a very proud member of the Tech Podcast Network. The Tech Podcast Network is an awesome community of tech podcasters who all have family-friendly podcasts about technology. So you don't have to hide your kids and hide your wives when you're listening to any of these, or hide your podcasts from your kids and your wives if you get it from techpodcasts.com. They've got so many things over there on all kinds of technology, Linux, and there's a new podcast actually about podcasting, podcastingtechcoach.com, from my friend Mike Dell, who also works for Blueberry and Raw Voice. So check out that and so much more. If it's tech, it's here. Find more at techpodcasts.com.